In the heart of occupied Poland, a network of railway tracks led to a place whose name became synonymous with planned death. Auschwitz was not just a camp, but the central cog of a system created for the detention, exploitation, and extermination of millions of people. Its facilities combined administrative control, industrial capacity, and logistics designed to eliminate lives with methodical precision. Behind electrified barbed wire and watchtowers, each building, each track, and each warehouse fulfilled a specific function within machinery destined to annihilate without leaving a trace. For years, trains loaded with men, women, and children crossed its gates, and most never returned. Among documents, plans, and preserved remains, the magnitude of the horror is still revealed today. What secrets do the archives that survived the destruction still hold? In the first months after the National Socialist Party came to power in Germany in 1933, the first centers intended for the detention of political opponents were created. They emerged in different cities and towns, often in improvised places like basements, abandoned warehouses, or sports facilities. The goal was to isolate and break the resistance of communists, social democrats, trade unionists, and other adversaries of the regime. In July of that same year, the number of people interned under what was called protective custody already reached 27,000. The purpose was to eliminate any form of political opposition through imprisonment without trial or time limit. In this first stage, the facilities were under the responsibility of the SA, the party militia, characterized by the use of violence against those who did not share their ideology. After the Reichstag fire, the government issued decrees that suspended fundamental rights and allowed indefinite arrests. Arrests were carried out in a planned manner, though not without visible brutality in the streets and homes. In 1934, the SS, led by Heinrich Himmler, progressively assumed control of these centers. Theodor Eicke was named Inspector General and commander of the unit in charge of administering them. Under his direction, a regime based on extreme discipline and systematic violence was established. The motto he conveyed to the commanders was that indulgence represented weakness, fostering a climate of terror that completely nullified any rights of the prisoners. The duration of the confinement became arbitrary and unpredictable. The first formal camp under this model was Dachau, inaugurated on the 20th of March, 1933, a few kilometers from Munich. Initially, it housed German political opponents, but in the following years, it incorporated people from other groups: Jews, Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses, priests opposed to state control over churches, homosexuals, and people labeled as asocials. Conditions included extreme overcrowding, forced labor, and insufficient food. Over time, Dachau transformed into a complex with numerous subcamps, serving as a training center for guards and a model for future establishments. By the end of the decade, prisoners numbered in the tens of thousands. Among them, 10,000 Jews detained after Kristallnacht in November of 1938. That pogrom, organized by the Nazi apparatus and presented as a spontaneous reaction to an attack against a German diplomat in Paris, resulted in the destruction of businesses and synagogues, as well as the mass detention of people due to their Jewish origin. In Dachau, a block was also set aside for priests, mainly Polish Catholics, interned under an agreement between the Third Reich and the Vatican. In that block, there were around 3,000 religious figures, of whom about 1,000 died, especially during 1942. Among the detainees were Karl Leisner, ordained a priest within the camp, and Martin Niemöller, a Protestant pastor who had organized resistance against anti-Semitic measures. In addition to its repressive function, Dachau was the scene of medical experiments carried out by SS personnel. Prisoners were used to test drugs or subjected to extreme conditions, and those who became incapacitated were sent to euthanasia centers like Hartheim Castle, where they were executed with gas. This place was part of the program for eliminating people with mental or physical illnesses, presented as a policy of racial purity. In April of 1945, while a typhus epidemic caused numerous deaths, the SS evacuated 7,000 prisoners southward. Days later, American troops liberated the camp, finding more than 30,000 officially registered corpses. Between 1936 and 1939, the camp system expanded notably. In this second stage, those classified as asocial or criminals were also interned. Vague categories that included prostitutes, beggars, Roma, or people without a fixed address. Camps such as Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, Ravensbrück, intended mainly for women, Neuengamme and Stutthof were incorporated. Although labor exploitation gained greater weight, repression and humiliation remained central objectives. The annexation of Austria and the Sudetenland in 1938 brought with it an increase in political prisoners, which led to the opening of facilities in those territories, such as Mauthausen in Austria, near a quarry where exhausting work caused very high mortality. That same year, Kristallnacht led to the detention of 36,000 Jews throughout the Reich, sent to concentration camps under the classification of preventive detention. A testimony from the time describes the arrival of a group of Jewish detainees at Dachau. After remaining standing all night without access to restrooms, they were led to a barrack to undress and shave their heads. They received striped uniforms and were registered. Among them, a mathematics professor struck a guard who was assaulting him and was subjected to a public punishment of 25 lashes in front of a circle of prisoners forced to witness it. The punishment included the application of salt and pepper to the wounds, and the victim disappeared from the camp, never to be seen again. During this period, arrests also began to respond to the labor needs for the works of the four-year plan promoted by the regime. Prisoners were sent to build fortifications, roads, and other military infrastructures. This systematic use of slave labor became a permanent element of Nazi policy towards detainees. The internal administration of the camps included a hierarchy among prisoners. Some were designated barrack chiefs or kapos, responsible for supervising work groups. In return, they received better rations, additional clothing, or their own space. These roles frequently fell to German prisoners convicted of common crimes, who often used violence against others to maintain their position. At the base of this structure were Soviet prisoners and Jews, with the lowest chances of survival. By the end of the decade, the camp system was already consolidated as an instrument of political repression, social control, and economic exploitation. Its geographical expansion covered not only Germany, but also annexed territories or those under Reich control. The administrative, logistical, and disciplinary model, perfected in places like Dachau, served as a reference for new facilities. The prisoners' routine combined forced labor, hunger, and physical punishments. Accommodations consisted of overcrowded barracks without adequate heating, with wooden bunks and straw infested with insects. Sanitary facilities were insufficient and in deplorable conditions. Diseases, particularly dysentery and typhus, spread rapidly, aggravated by malnutrition. The system was designed to break the internees physically and psychologically, eliminating any sense of personal dignity. From the moment of entry, they were stripped of their identity, replaced by a number. Every aspect of daily life was timed and monitored. Non-compliance with orders, even in minor details, could entail extreme sanctions. In those years prior to the outbreak of the war, the camps went from being improvised centers for political opponents to a structured network centrally administered by the SS. The experience accumulated in their management laid the groundwork for the subsequent transformation of the system into a mechanism of mass repression and extermination. The outbreak of the conflict in September of 1939 marked a decisive change in the use of the camps. The invasion of Poland not only expanded the Reich's borders, but also multiplied the number of people considered hostile by the regime. In the occupied zones, centers were created to gather members of local elites, political leaders, military personnel, and anyone suspected of opposing the occupation. The existing network was adapted to receive prisoners of very diverse origins. In addition to the already operational camps, facilities were built in strategic locations, close to railway lines and industrial centers. The administration systematically integrated captive labor into economic and military projects, supervised by a specific SS department responsible for coordinating forced employment in state and private companies. With the advance of the occupation, transit camps emerged in countries like France, the Netherlands, and Belgium. These places served to concentrate deportees before sending them to larger centers. Their function was primarily logistical, to register, classify, and organize transfers to labor camps, or later, extermination camps. In parallel, camps for Polish prisoners of war began to operate, and after the invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941, for soldiers captured on the Eastern Front. Mortality rates among the latter were especially high. In some facilities, such as Poniatowa in the Lublin region, tens of thousands died of starvation and disease in a few months. According to later estimates, more than half of the Soviet prisoners captured during the war did not survive. At this stage, the camp system functioned not only as a tool of repression, but also as a fundamental cog in the war economy. Assigned tasks ranged from the construction of fortifications and roads to the production of armaments. The length of shifts and the nature of tasks were designed to obtain maximum physical output, without consideration for the prisoners' health. In October of 1942, a plan conceived since the previous year, all Jewish prisoners interned in camps within German territory were transferred to centers located in the east, such as Auschwitz and Majdanek. In these places, the majority fate was immediate execution or labor exploitation until death. The period was also marked by the annexation of new territories and the need to reinforce control. Camps were established in newly incorporated areas, utilizing pre-existing buildings or constructing new barracks. Some served to intern entire populations considered problematic, while others specialized in the classification of goods seized from deportees. The system continued to expand. The number of auxiliary facilities linked to factories or agricultural operations increased, which allowed forced labor to be extended to different regions, with less public visibility and greater local control. Coordination between the SS and the Gestapo ensured that any suspect could be arrested and sent to these places without the need for judicial process. Arrests could be based on informant reports, mass raids, or simple criteria of administrative convenience, favoring indiscriminate repression. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941 marked another turning point. The magnitude of the fighting and the number of captured prisoners exceeded any precedent. Camps designated for Soviet soldiers became scenes of mass death, both from summary executions and from the conditions of confinement. In many cases, deaths occurred even before prisoners reached their final destination. In parallel, the regime began to experiment with more systematic methods of killing. Until then, executions were carried out mainly by firing squads, but the scale of the conflict and Nazi racial ideology prompted the search for procedures capable of eliminating large groups with less direct involvement of the executioners. These initial trials would be the prelude to the policy that, shortly after, would be known as the final solution. The administrative structure was reinforced to meet the new needs. The central department in charge of the camps established uniform rules for the management, transport, and labor of prisoners. Each main camp had sections dedicated to entry registration, classification of goods, labor assignment, and discipline control, while sub-camps depended hierarchically on these headquarters. The territorial expansion of the Reich also meant the incorporation of infrastructure in occupied countries. In Poland especially, military buildings and industrial complexes were adapted to house thousands of detainees. The strategic location near train lines facilitated the constant arrival of prisoners from various parts of Europe. By the end of 1941, the system had evolved from a set of dispersed camps to an interconnected network administered with standardized criteria. This network allowed a rapid response to the regime's needs, whether repressive or economic. The combination of political repression, racial persecution, and labor exploitation defined its daily operation. In many cases, permanence in a camp was not the final destination, but a preliminary stage to deportation to more lethal places. Transfers were carried out in closed and overloaded wagons, causing numerous deaths before arrival. Testimonies collected years later confirm that this phase represented a notable hardening in the treatment of prisoners and in the lethality of the system. Planning was increasingly oriented towards the physical elimination of certain groups, even when the policy of total extermination had not yet been formally adopted. The deterioration of conditions, overpopulation, and scarcity of resources were common throughout the network. The SS administration maintained meticulous control over entry and exit figures, as well as over the productivity of assigned labor, reducing prisoners to simple figures in a mechanism adjusted according to military and economic needs. In the summer of 1941, the German invasion of the Soviet Union opened a new front, and with it, an unprecedented phase in the regime's policy. Military operations in the east were accompanied by special units tasked with eliminating those considered ideological and racial enemies. These formations, known as Einsatzgruppen, operated in the rear of the army, identifying and executing groups designated in the directives: communist cadres, intellectuals, political commissars, and, systematically, entire Jewish communities. The actions were swift and lethal. Cities and towns were surrounded, orders were issued to concentrate the targeted population, and, after a process of registration and confiscation of belongings, mass executions proceeded. The Babi Yar ravine in Kiev became one of the symbols of this stage. At the end of September 1941, in just 2 days, more than 30,000 Jews were murdered there. The bodies were thrown into previously excavated mass graves and covered with earth, while new groups were led to the site. The magnitude and frequency of these massacres led the Nazi leadership to seek methods that would allow the murder of large numbers of people in a more controlled manner, and with less psychological impact on the perpetrators. Simultaneously, discussions were underway in Berlin regarding the management of conquered territory and the fate of its inhabitants. In the autumn of that year, the decision to physically eliminate the European Jewish population was solidified as official policy. The conference held in Wannsee in January 1942 served to coordinate the practical aspects of the so-called final solution to the Jewish question. Representatives from different ministries, high-ranking SS officers and transport officials defined routes, priorities, and methods. The railway network was to become the axis of a mass deportation system towards facilities specifically built for industrialized murder. The first extermination centers were established in areas of occupied Poland. Chelmno began its operations in December 1941, using sealed vans in which victims were suffocated with gases from exhaust pipes. This method was considered an initial model, although fixed installations were soon opted for to increase capacity and reduce times. In 1942, the plan known as Operation Reinhardt led to the construction and commissioning of Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. These places shared a design oriented towards efficiency, proximity to railway lines, reception areas, undressing zones, gas chambers, and pits or facilities for the incineration of corpses. The sequence was calculated to minimize resistance: arrival, registration, instructions, separation by sex and age, confiscation of belongings, and immediate transfer to the chambers under the pretext of disinfection. The time between arrival and death rarely exceeded 2 hours. Bodies were initially buried, but over time incineration was chosen to destroy evidence. This change occurred after the first leaked information about what was happening and to prevent open graves from revealing the scale of the massacres. Majdanek and Auschwitz, initially conceived as concentration and labor camps, were also adapted to serve as extermination facilities. In Birkenau, a sector of Auschwitz, large gas chambers were erected, fed with Zyklon B, a pesticide that released hydrocyanic acid upon contact with air. The procedure involved introducing the product in granule form through openings in the roof or sides, causing death in a few minutes. The facilities were connected to crematoria, where bodies were continuously eliminated. The design included vestibules, undressing rooms, airtight chambers, and aligned ovens to maintain a constant flow. The daily capacity of these facilities reached several thousands of victims. For tasks related to the process, prisoners selected upon arrival, known as Sonderkommando, were employed. Their function included removing bodies, cutting hair, extracting valuables, transferring remains to the ovens or pits, and cleaning the chambers for the next group. These teams were periodically replaced and eliminated to reduce the risk of witnesses. Mass transport to these places required precise coordination. Entire convoys departed from ghettos, transit camps, or detention centers in various occupied countries, scheduled to coincide with the operational capacity of the receiving facilities. Throughout 1943, armed resistance in some ghettos and escape attempts in certain camps led to additional security measures. Barbed wire was reinforced, additional watchtowers were installed, and the presence of armed guards was increased. In Sobibor and Treblinka, internal revolts led to the closure and dismantling of the facilities after the elimination of most of the prisoners. In Auschwitz-Birkenau, however, the operation continued and expanded. By mid-1944, the mass deportation of Hungarian Jews was carried out. In just a few weeks, hundreds of thousands were transported directly to the gas chambers. The speed and scale of these operations marked one of the system's mortality peaks. Information about what was happening reached the Allied powers through reports prepared by prisoners who had managed to escape. Among them, the document drafted by Rudolf Vrba and Alfred Wetzler in 1944 described in detail the structure of Auschwitz, the location of the chambers and crematoria, and the approximate numbers of victims. Although this report did not manage to stop the operations, it later served as evidence in judicial proceedings against those responsible for the system. Mass extermination was not limited to Jewish communities. Among the victims were Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, and people from various European countries considered unassimilable by Nazi ideology. However, the racial component and systematic planning against the Jewish population constituted the core of the annihilation plan. In this period, technology and organization combined to produce an unprecedented death mechanism. The experience accumulated since 1933 was now applied with a unique objective: the physical elimination of entire populations. The structures created, the established routes, and the trained personnel functioned as a production chain whose result was the disappearance of thousands of people every day. The transformation of Auschwitz into an extermination complex was consolidated in 1942 when it was decided to expand its facilities to process massive deportations. The Birkenau area, located a few kilometers from the original camp, was chosen to house the necessary infrastructure. The plans contemplated several reception units, 4 crematories with integrated gas chambers, and independent sectors for different categories of prisoners, according to the SS classification. The perimeter had double electrified fences and watchtowers on each corner and along the internal divisions. Between the blocks, guarded corridors were traced, allowing the movement of patrols with direct vision over any displacement. The railway tracks penetrated into the interior of the enclosure, facilitating that the convoys arrived directly to the selection area. Upon the arrival of a transport, the evaluation of the people was carried out in a few minutes. SS medical officers determined who would be assigned to specific jobs and who would be sent immediately to the gas chambers. The extermination buildings gathered disrobing areas, hermetic chambers, and cremation rooms. Zyklon B, stored under controlled conditions, was introduced through systems that avoided direct contact. After the operation, the bodies were transported in forklifts or metal carts to ovens designed for continuous operation. The storage and classification of confiscated goods was a central part of the system. Complete barracks were designated for clothes, footwear, utensils, and valuable objects. Specialized teams packaged and labeled the articles for their shipment to Germany or to central deposits, separating the materials by type and recovering precious metals. In 1943, the crematories 2 and 3 were modified to increase the incineration speed. The ovens operated without interruption, with permanent maintenance to avoid failures. The ashes were eliminated in pits or dispersed in rivers and fields, according to the volume generated. The centralized administration registered the arrival of each transport, the number of people, the labor assignments, and the resulting figures of each operation. These reports, precisely archived, were remitted to superior commands to evaluate efficiency and plan operations. In 1944, the massive deportation of Jews from Hungary pushed the complex's capacity to its limit. Temporary waiting areas were enabled, and the use of the facilities was intensified. During these weeks, trains arrived daily, and the time between unloading and execution was reduced to a minimum. The quarantine sector, conceived to isolate new prisoners, was used as an intermediate space for selected groups, maintaining separation by sex and under permanent surveillance. The security deployment included canine patrols, night rounds, long-range spotlights, and direct communication between towers and the central office. In addition to the extermination and storage areas, there were workshops to repair railway material, make uniforms, and maintain weaponry. Located in the northern part of Birkenau, they used labor under strict supervision and were linked to contracts with German companies in the war sector. In late 1944 and early 1945, during the German retreat, it was ordered to destroy part of the facilities to hide evidence. Crematories 4 and 5 were dismantled or set on fire, and the operation of the remaining ovens was reduced. The evacuation to other camps further inland was organized in forced marches that caused numerous deaths due to exhaustion and extreme cold. On the 15th of January of 1945, preparations began to empty complete sectors, prioritizing those who could work. The main column departed to the west under armed custody, executing stragglers on the spot. On the 20th of January, activity ceased in the crematories and documents and records were burned. On the 27th of January of 1945, Soviet troops reached the perimeter of Auschwitz-Birkenau. Inside, they found thousands of prisoners who had not been evacuated, along with warehouses full of belongings and remains of the extermination infrastructure. The magnitude of the recovered material evidenced the scale of the operations developed there during almost 3 years. The complex, conceived to concentrate prisoners, had evolved to become the core of a mass murder system, integrated into the administrative and economic structure of the regime, and kept active until the last days before its liberation. The vestiges that still remain in Auschwitz-Birkenau allow to accurately reconstruct the gearing of a machinery conceived to function without interruptions. Every wall, every plan, every document, and every recovered object constitutes a piece of a record that reflects the capacity of a system to plan and execute, with precise method, the elimination of millions of people. The liberation of the complex did not mean the immediate closure of this comprehension work, but it did open the way to a sustained process that, over decades, has gathered testimonies, inventories, and material evidence. These elements, preserved and analyzed, have allowed to know in detail the magnitude and scope of the operations developed in that place, offering a documented vision of how one of the most meticulously structured annihilation systems of the 20th century was organized and executed.